Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett. Thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to do something completely different, something I don't think anybody has ever done. Today's episode is called UFOs in the American Sitcom. I'm going to take a look at the situation comedy and how the UFO subject has been portrayed. There's a really interesting coincidence about situation comedies. It turns out that the first American sitcom appeared in 1947, coinciding exactly with the modern age of UFOs. That's certainly an interesting synchronicity. But I think this is an important subject because the situation comedy accurately reflects how we thought and what we wore and everything that we do, all our activities of that particular era. So I think has some interesting things to say about how we view the UFO subject. UFOs do appear in all forms of media, including, of course, books and science fiction, but definitely movies and video games and advertising and songs. I mean, you name it, UFOs are reflected there. That's absolutely true for situation comedies. What's also interesting is that situation comedies have very bravely portrayed many controversial issues, pretty much across the board, which would include such things as crime and corruption, sexuality, religion, economics, poverty, and the unequal distribution of wealth, health, mortality, racism, drug use. I mean, you name it, politics, all of it. These have all been portrayed in the situation comedy, often in a hilarious way. And of course, this includes the UFO subject. And boy, is it interesting to see how UFOs and ETs have been portrayed throughout the years. So in this episode, I'm going to be looking at the more high-profile sitcoms, because there's a lot of them. I found about 24 that portray the UFO subject at any length. Many have not touched it at all, but many have, and they have a lot to say about how we view this subject. So I did do a much deeper dive into all of this in my book, Not From Here, Volume 5. I devoted a whole chapter to all of this. If you want to learn more about it, please check that out. So let's just get started. And the first situation comedy that I'd like to cover is probably one of the most famous, probably one of the best as well. I'm a huge fan. And that is, of course, I Love Lucy. This first aired on October 15th, 1951. It was a huge success. It sort of set the template for all other situation comedies. And it was really interesting when they first tackled the UFO subject. Although I Love Lucy was hugely successful, it only ran for 6 seasons, producing 180 episodes, and it was in episode 89, titled Lucy is Envious, that they portrayed the UFO subject. In this episode, Lucy and Ethel accidentally each pledged a $500 donation to their wealthy friend's charity, but they had no way to pay. So, to recoup their losses, Lucy and Ethel agreed to take part in a scheme to make some money. And they were hired by an advertising executive at a movie studio and agreed to participate in what is essentially a UFO hoax, each of them dressing up as, quote, Woman from Mars. This was to help promote a movie. So they surprised a group of UFO believers on the top of a building and pretended to speak Martian, all dressed up in Martian costumes. They approached the group, picking curiously at their clothes and studying them like ETs might study a human, until they pointed a paralyzing ray at one of them, a man, of course, who was in on the hoax, and they carted him away, essentially abducting him. So Lucy and Ethel, of course, did get paid their money, but alas, the subject of UFOs was treated as a joke. If you've seen that episode, I'm sure you'll agree it's hilarious. Lucille Ball is an absolute genius when it comes to comedy. What I do think is interesting about that particular episode is UFOs as a genuine, real thing were not portrayed in that episode. It was all considered just a hoax, which I think is how a lot of people viewed that subject at that time. So that is interesting in and of itself. But now let's move to the next sitcom. And again, we're going in chronological order here. The next situation comedy I'd like to cover is My Three Sons. Can't say that I've watched a lot of episodes of this situation comedy. It was a little bit before my time, but I did track down this particular episode. My Three Sons first aired on September 29, 1960, and again, it was a huge success. It went for 12 seasons, and they had a very interesting episode portraying the UFO subject. My Three Sons was very successful, running for 12 seasons, producing 380 episodes. It was season 7, episode 15, titled You Saw What?, airing on January 5, 1967, that featured the UFO subject. The episode begins with the youngest son, Ernie, asking his two brothers and father to play catch on a Saturday afternoon. Fortunately, everyone's busy, so Ernie heads out into the woods with his dog, Tramp. And he throws the ball. Tramp goes to fetch it, but instead starts barking at something. And Ernie, going to investigate, is shocked to see a glowing flying saucer landed in a clearing in the woods. You can see it here. This craft is making weird beeping noises, and seeing this craft, Ernie shouts out to his dog Tramp, "Come on, let's get out of here." So he flees immediately to a group of friends who ask him what's wrong, and he tells them, "You'd never believe it unless you saw it. Come on, I need witnesses." And he returns with the three boys to this site, but the disc is gone. All that is left is a circle of crushed and burned vegetation and broken branches in the trees. So these are landing traces, and it's an accurate portrayal of landing traces. Even with this, still, none of Ernie's friends believe him, and instead they ridicule him and tell him he needs to visit a, quote, head shrinker. So Ernie returns home and tells Uncle Charlie, who does believe him. But, as Ernie says, "Now let's forget it. I've learned to keep quiet the hard way." So Ernie has already learned that there's ridicule surrounding this subject and doesn't want to talk about it. But his Uncle Charlie is curious, so they return to the site and examine the landing traces. But going back home and sharing all of this with his family, Ernie is once again greeted with disbelief and ridicule. His father tells him, "I don't believe you saw a flying saucer." But little Ernie is not to be dissuaded. He returns to the site with a camera, and lo and behold, the craft shows up again, and this time he actually captures a photograph of the disc as it's hovering among the trees. So later, seeing this photo, Ernie's father, Mr. Douglas, alerts the Air Force, and seeing the photograph, Air Force General Carstairs decides he's going to cover up the incident. But when Mr. Douglas refuses to destroy the photograph and tell his son that it was all just his imagination like the general wants him to, General Carstairs admits the truth and says that the saucer is actually our own, a top-secret classified program called Project Moonbeam. That's interesting because I believe that is an actual project. So when Ernie learns all of this, he agrees to cooperate and keep quiet about the photographs. But the problem is, Ernie's already agreed to go on television to talk about his sighting. So as he's interviewed on television, he goes along with the cover-up, lies about the photo, says it shows nothing, and helped to cover up the incident. Actually talked complete nonsense about seeing, quote, little green men in purple suits. This, no surprise, leads to merciless ridiculing from his classmates at school. And ultimately, Ernie's photo remains a secret, not even revealed to Uncle Charlie or Ernie's two brothers, and the sighting remains explained as a secret government project. How interesting is that? I thought that was actually a really good episode and portrayed the subject in a pretty well-balanced way. Unfortunately, it turned out that this, of course, was a secret government project, which is still really interesting because a lot of what people are seeing, I think, probably is our own craft. So that is an interesting episode in that regard. They didn't see an actual UFO, so it is a bit dismissive of the whole subject, but still super interesting. Now let's move to the next one. I almost didn't include this one because it's an animated sitcom, but I figured, you know what? Let's be comprehensive here. let's take a look at all the portrayals of how this subject has been put on TV. And the next sitcom that I'm taking a look at is, of course, the very popular The Flintstones. I've watched this episode many times, or this series, I should say, but UFOs were portrayed more than once on The Flintstones. This is a sitcom that aired from 1960 to 1966, and of course was so popular it even was transformed into a feature-length live-action film. But yeah, they portrayed the UFO subject in a pretty interesting way, as we shall see. First episode on The Flintstones to feature the UFO subject was on Season 4, Episode 16, in an episode called 10 Little Flintstones. It talks about how UFOs come around the town of Bedrock, and both Fred and Wilma are skeptical of the reports, but when Fred goes outside to dispose of the garbage, a UFO lands, actually scans him, and get this, produces 10 little clones of Fred Flintstone, which are released throughout town to gather information and, ostensibly, take over the world. Unfortunately, the only phrase that these ET clones can utter is yabba dabba doo. The aliens end up wreaking havoc in the town of Bedrock, visiting the Rubbles and Mr. Slate and the other characters, causing endless problems for Fred before finally leaving. But it was episode 7 in season 6, titled The Great Gazoo, that actually introduced Fred and Barney to a little green alien named the Great Gazoo from the planet Zetox. He was a short, green-skinned alien, a huge helmeted head, somewhat similar to reports we have today, and he decided to help out the modern Stone Age family on numerous occasions, but his help always seemed to come at a price. For example, he set up a dinner at a luxury restaurant for the Flintstones and the Rubbles, but then split without paying the bill. And it wasn't long after the Great Gazoo's appearance that the Fred Flintstone show was canceled. Pretty funny portrayal of the subject, and I have to say it's the first sitcom to portray ETs as a real thing. I mean, these were, in the sitcom, actual ETs coming down to clone Fred Flintstone, which is a theme that still crops up in some UFO contactee accounts. I don't know how accurate that is, but it's certainly interesting. I also find it interesting that the Great Gazoo appeared in the Flintstones, and it was shortly after that that the sitcom was canceled. That's probably pure coincidence. But it's a very interesting portrayal of, how UFOs might invade a small town and how all of people react to this invasion, so to speak, of UFOs. So yeah, certainly an important episode. Now let's move to the next one. I'm a huge fan of the Dick Van Dyke Show. Again, a little bit before my time, but I've certainly seen quite a few episodes. The Dick Van Dyke Show ran for 6 seasons from October 3rd, 1961 to June 1st, 1966. It was a huge success, made Mary Tyler Moore a huge star, gave her a spin-off of her own situation comedy, and of course Dick Van Dyke. I mean, he's just the greatest when it comes to comedy. So it should come as no surprise that they tackled the UFO subject as well. And it was pretty interesting what happened in this particular episode. With 158 episodes, the Dick Van Dyke Show was very successful. But it took them a while to cover the UFO subject. It was during Season 5 and Episode 3, in an episode titled Unny Uffs, that featured the UFO subject. Rob, suffering from overwork and exhaustion while working late at night on a script for the Alan Brady Show, he saw this flying saucer hovering outside the window of his office. And to his shock, it utters this mysterious kind of foreign language phrase, Unny Uffs. Now, Rob is absolutely convinced he had an encounter with ETs, so he contacts authorities who, no surprise here, do not believe him and ridicule him. Rob is so impressed he even consults a psychiatrist. When Rob does tell his coworker Buddy about the flying saucer, Buddy says, all the flying saucers in the world, he has to get one with a speech impediment. So Rob is finally convinced that this was all an exhaustion-produced hallucination when both he and Buddy hear the same mysterious phrase coming from the air vent. So apparently that solves the mystery. It's not a UFO at all, just a dream prompted by weird sounds coming from the air vent. So kudos to the Dick Van Dyke Show for having the courage to portray the UFO subject, but shame on them for basically explaining it all away as basically a hallucination, a dream. So this was not really a serious treatment of the subject, and certainly not accurate, but reflected how a lot of people were thinking about UFOs at that time. A lot of skepticism back then. So, times are changing. The next episode or sitcom I'd like to talk about is a hugely popular sitcom called The Beverly Hillbillies. I think we've probably all seen an episode of The Beverly Hillbillies. If you haven't, check it out. It's pretty funny. I will admit, it is a hilarious show. It's not one I watched regularly, but I've certainly seen many episodes of it. But I was quite shocked to find out that they have portrayed the UFO subject. I didn't remember that episode at all. The Beverly Hillbillies aired from 1962 to 1971 and was a huge smash hit. And their portrayal of the UFO subject is pretty interesting. The Beverly Hillbillies was always kind of known for its over-the-top comedy. And in season 5, episode 16, titled The Flying Saucer, they definitely followed this pattern. This episode centers around their neighbor and opportunist, a con man by the name of Milburn Drysdale, who manufactures a hoax by modifying a New Year's Day balloon to look like a flying saucer. He then hires 3 midgets and dresses them up in Martian costumes, secreting them along with his flying saucer in the backyard. And in true Beverly Hillbillies style, nosy Granny Clampett discovers the flying saucer and the little green men. And this leads to all kinds of hilarious antics, but ends up with the ETs eventually being invited over for dinner at the Clampetts. And they eat so much that Granny actually goes after them with her shotgun. So the episode, while filled with hilarity and honestly really funny, presents the UFO subject with no real seriousness and ultimately treats it all as a joke. So that's the Beverly Hillbillies. And yeah, they treated it all as a hoax. Again, this is how people viewed the UFO subject at that time, so no surprise, but certainly an interesting portrayal of what happens when a family has a UFO encounter, or what they perceive to be a UFO encounter. Now let's move to the next sitcom, which was a very popular sitcom. I enjoyed it very much. Thought it was really cute. This is, of course, Green Acres with Eddie Albert and Ava Gabor. It was a really funny sort of fish out of water comedy and absolutely this very interesting portrayal of the UFO subject. With a setting as a farm in a very rural area, Green Acres really was the perfect setting for a UFO visitation. It was a very popular show, lasted 6 seasons, and explored the UFO subject in season 2, episode 25, titled The Saucer Season. This was a term that had already been coined by journalists. And it begins with their goofy farmhand, who's not very well educated and kind of naive. His name is Ed. He claims to have seen a UFO. Now, while Oliver and Lisa, the main characters, are enjoying a picnic lunch, Hank Kimball, played by Alvy Moore, approaches them and tells them there have been 3 saucer sightings in the last month. Oliver is skeptical, but Lisa believes him because Ed claims to have seen an ET face to face, and he tells Oliver he saw a flying saucer and says, quote, "It was about 11 o'clock at night, and I was getting ready for bed when this saucer buzzed the barn." So Oliver tells him to get lost until that night at 3 a.m. he hears Ed talking to someone outside his bedroom window. Oliver wakes up, and Ed is there claiming he saw the ETs and actually had a conversation with the ETs face to face. The next morning, Oliver tries to convince Ed he was dreaming, but Ed says, "No, sir. It was a real flying saucer," provided a vivid and detailed description. He said it circled the barn and then dropped straight down. He said there were two ETs, one male, one female, that they had green skin, and here's where the ridicule comes in. The male ET was wearing a purple dress. Nevertheless, Ebb's story catches the attention of the local news reporter and gets reported in the Hooterville paper, and crowds show up wanting to meet Ebb. Oliver gets angry when the crowds begin to trample his fields of corn. This is something many real UFO witnesses in real life have suffered with. But then Lieutenant Bennett from the United States Air Force shows up, claiming to be part of the Air Force UFO Investigation Department. He interviews Ebb, but as Ebb tries to provide details, he strangely lapses into a trance, and all he can say is bleep, bleep, bleep. Now he has no memory of this. He believes the ETs are blanking out his mind as they don't want the military to know the truth. But Ebb took a photo, turned out blank. When Oliver sees the photo, he decides to put an end to all this UFO talk and just throws the photo into the fire on the potbelly stove. And this is how the episode ends. As they leave the room, the stove turns mysteriously green. Ultimately, that wasn't really a serious portrayal of UFOs, but certainly interesting. Once again, we have an unreliable character as the one seeing the UFO or the ETs. But interesting too, because it does portray an accurate sort of representation of how our own governments are covering this subject up, and also leaves the whole subject open at the very end when there's that mysterious incident with the stove turning green. But really unfortunate with him, the main character Eddie Albert, throwing away the photo that could have actually provided evidence. And now we move to another really popular sitcom called I Dream of Jeannie. This made its first appearance on September 18, 1965, was hugely popular, and I think provided a really good background to present the UFO subject, in that the main character, Tony Nelson, is an actual astronaut. How they treated the subject? Well, that's a completely different story, as we shall see. I Dream of Jeannie was a huge hit with audiences. It lasted for 5 years, and it was episode 88, titled UFO Jeannie, that appeared in 1968, that featured the UFO subject. Now, Tony, Jeannie's astronaut husband, and Roger, Tony's friend and also an astronaut, were conducting a test flight of an aircraft that, as it turns out, very closely resembles a classic flying saucer. But in mid-flight, Jeannie magically transports herself into this craft, and her added weight causes the craft to fall off course and land in a rural area. And this is when a family of hillbillies comes up to the scene and believe that the object is an actual flying saucer, and that Tony, Roger, and Jeannie are actually human-looking Martians. And they hold them at gunpoint and contact NASA, hoping for a reward. Of course, at the end of the episode, the truth is revealed. No mention is made of the reality of the UFO phenomena. Interestingly, the UFO prop came directly from the other show, the Beverly Hillbillies. So yes, they did portray the UFO subject in very much the way that My Three Sons did. Not as actual extraterrestrials, but rather as a government secret project. Such a shame. I mean, that is accurate, I should say, but again, pretty much bypassing the actual cases where people are seeing genuine UFOs that cannot be explained as government secret projects or what have you. But certainly interesting. Now we move to the next one. The next sitcom I found that portrayed the UFO subject is Bewitched. I was a huge fan of Bewitched. Samantha was an amazing character who, it was just an interesting and fun show. Actually, a takeoff from a major film, I Married a Witch. Hugely successful sitcom. It ran for 8 years. The first episode aired on September 17, 1964, and lasted till 1972. Tackled many different subjects. It was a very funny sitcom, and of course they had a very interesting UFO episode. Bewitched featured the UFO subject in Season 4, Episode 30, with the episode titled Samantha's Secret Saucer. It was their first and last episode of the whole series to feature UFOs. It aired on April 18, 1968, and the episode begins with Samantha's toddler daughter, Tabitha, playing with her toy remote-controlled flying saucer. But when Tabitha loses her toy saucer outside, Aunt Clara, the incompetent witch, casts a spell to bring the saucer back inside, and instead causes the tiny toy saucer to expand to a full-size craft, which lands in the backyard. And no surprise when nosy neighbor Gladys Kravitz sees the craft and calls the Air Force. Soon the Air Force arrives to investigate, and Darren Stevens, the harried husband, is able to explain away the life-size saucer as a prop for an advertising campaign. But the plot takes a real twist, and this is interesting when it turns out the toy saucer is, in fact, lost, and the flying saucer in the backyard is actually a real, honest-to-God flying saucer, which was summoned a la CE5 style, Close Encounter of the Fifth Kind, by Aunt Clara. And this saucer is occupied by two live humanoid, dog-like aliens. They're named Orvis and Alpha, and they're friendly ETs, but they just want to go home. And of course, nosy Miss Kravitz sees the ETs and again calls the Air Force. And annoyed by this, Orvis hits her with a ray gun, which turns her sweet and kind, absolutely the opposite of her normal personality. Thankfully, it ends on a positive note when the ETs Orvis and Alpha are able to make it home. And this was, turns out, the same UFO prop that appeared in both the Beverly Hillbillies and I Dream of Jeannie. You have to give kudos to Bewitched for portraying ETs as actual living entities. First sitcom to say that yes, there are ETs, dog-like ETs, interestingly enough. So yeah, I mean, that's groundbreaking in and of itself. It's a very funny episode. So I think it's worth taking a look at. And again, we're starting to see a pattern here where we're moving towards this subject being portrayed a little bit more accurately. Now we move to the next sitcom, which was a huge smash hit, and I'm sure you've heard of it, The Brady Bunch. I always laughed at The Brady Bunch because I come from a family with 6 kids. And the Brady Bunch, I mean, it was just a little bit different for me, my experience with, having so many brothers and sisters. But certainly a fun show and groundbreaking, of course, with 2 divorced parents coming together and forming a new family. So it was groundbreaking in a number of different ways. And they did portray the UFO subject, and it was a fascinating episode. The Brady Bunch was definitely a mega hit. UFOs were quite popular at that time, so it's no surprise that they did cover the UFO subject in Season 5, Episode 16, titled Out of This World. Peter and Bobby are in the backyard when they see what they believe is a UFO, a glowing disc hovering above their backyard. Little do they know that this is a hoax. They've become victims of a hoax pulled off by their older brother Greg. It's quite an elaborate hoax where Greg puts up a sheet and uses a flashlight with a little filter to make it shaped like a flying saucer and a little whistle, a whole deal to make this hoax seem very believable. And it absolutely fools Peter and Bobby, but then Marcia, the oldest sister, catches Greg in the act, but decides to join in on the hoax. So Bobby and Peter not only see this UFO, they capture a photograph. Meanwhile, Bobby is starting to dream about meeting ETs face to face. And this whole hoax backfires when their father, Mike Brady, actually phones Carter Air Force Base to report this sighting. Air Force Captain McCartney shows up to conduct an investigation of, quote, things that don't exist. He says there are no such things as UFO. But the whole story takes a twist when the captain himself sees the hoaxed UFO and falls for it, believes it to be genuine, and reports it to the military himself. Then, of course, the hoax is revealed Greg and the embarrassed Air Force captain agree to engage in a cover-up of the entire event. And in the end, the episode leaves the viewing public with the impression that all UFOs are the result of hoaxes, hallucinations, and misperceptions. Here we go again, UFOs being portrayed as nothing but a hoax. Such a shame. I'm also starting to notice another pattern. The witnesses who see the UFO are usually those who are least reliable. Sort of naive, very young, uneducated, with Bobby and Cindy falling for Greg's hoax of a UFO. But a very interesting episode overall, and I think it's starting to show once again how people feel about this subject. Moving along, here's another sitcom that I certainly watched. I wasn't a regular viewer of it, but I've enjoyed many episodes of Barney Miller. This is a very interesting sort of police department sitcom. It first aired in 1975 and tackled the UFO subject much deeper into its run of episodes. But I will say this is probably the most accurate portrayal of a UFO encounter up to this time in the situation comedy. The Barney Miller Show was hugely successful. It won multiple awards, and it featured the UFO subject in episode 79 titled The Sighting. And this follows the experience of eccentric and dim-witted police officer Stan Wojciechowicz. Stan was on his way home from work and saw a UFO hovering over Staten Island, New York. So the next day, he tells his coworkers and his boss that he saw, quote, some kind of spaceship. No surprise, they do not believe him. To Stan's credit, he sticks to his guns, saying that the craft was, quote, a kind of silver metal color and it was shaped like a cigar. So the Air Force arrives to interview him. They refuse to validate Stan's sighting. However, the next morning, Stan is fully vindicated when it's discovered that the local police station received more than a half-dozen calls from other witnesses reporting the same object in the same area. So other than the fact that the UFO witness, Stan, is initially considered unreliable, it's a surprisingly accurate and fair treatment of the subject, and really the first sitcom to ultimately affirm the reality of the UFO phenomenon in a serious way. Yeah, I'm just going to underline it. That was a good episode. It was portrayed well, accurately. My only real complaint is that the person who saw the UFO was considered, again, the least reliable character in that sitcom. And this is a pattern that turns up again and again, and I'm really concerned about it because it's just not accurate. People of all educational levels, people of every strata of society encounter UFOs. But a very good portrayal of an important subject. Now moving along, the next sitcom I'd like to cover is called Soap. This is sort of a takeoff of soap operas mixed in with the situation comedy. It was a very popular show. It made its debut in 1977 and brought Billy Crystal into stardom, and really a very funny show on many levels, and also groundbreaking in some ways in terms of how the UFO subject is portrayed. The sitcom Soap lasted only 4 seasons, but it was considered to be very successful and did garner several Emmy Awards. It was on episode 46, Bert, who is absolutely portrayed as psychologically unstable, is driving along a road late at night when he sees a UFO. Now his family is skeptical of all of this, but Bert is driving again on that same stretch of road, sees the UFO again, only this time he is taken on board. And inside this craft, he sees short aliens with huge bald heads and large eyes. They're wearing silver suits, a pretty accurate portrayal of what many people report. But it does go off the rails a little bit when Bert is held captive with another man from the far distant past. And eventually, Bert escapes back to his home only to find that he has been cloned by the ETs. And there's an ET that looks just like him who has taken his place, for the sole reason of making love to Bert's wife. So Bert, with great difficulty, finally convinces his wife that he is the real Bert and that the alien is an imposter. And now that his identity is revealed, the ET departs. So while the storyline is admittedly preposterous, UFOs are portrayed as real, and it is, again, the first show that portrays someone actually being taken on board a craft. Fascinating episode, kind of showing that ETs might be living among us. I thought that was interesting. It's also the first live-action sitcom to portray somebody actually being taken on board a craft and seeing ETs face to face. So that in and of itself is groundbreaking. But once again, the character who sees the UFO is not the smartest guy on the show. Don't know why they keep doing that, and I'm disappointed about it. But still, they did portray the subject, so I'm glad about that. Now we move to another show, which was actually a spin-off of the sitcom soap, and this is called Benson, starring Robert Guillaume. It made its first appearance on September 13, 1979, and it was pretty successful. It ran for 8 years and eventually did cover the UFO subject in a pretty good way. I was impressed. Running for 8 years, Benson was considered a very successful show, which is amazing for a spin-off. They often have a real hard time, but Benson did tackle the UFO subject in episode 81 called Close Encounters on the Third Hole. The scene featuring the UFO features Benson and his employer, the governor, playing golf when a UFO shows up and actually beams them both with a beam of light. Now Benson disappears, dematerializes, while the governor starts searching frantically for him. Then the UFO returns, sends down a beam of light, and Benson reappears. So he's been taken on board. However, Benson has no memory of this at all, and in fact doesn't even remember seeing the UFO. So here we have the first portrayal of missing time. The only evidence of this encounter is that Benson is missing his watch. Now they do return to the golf course later, and lo and behold, the UFO reappears and returns Benson's watch. Now the governor asks, why didn't they land? And Benson says, well, they're probably shy. But he does say that was really something. So this is a very interesting and somewhat accurate portrayal of the UFO subject. Unfortunately, the governor is portrayed as a clueless politician. He goes public with this sighting, is disbelieved by almost everyone. The governor really wanted to go public. His friends urged him not to, but he did. The governor told his barber, who leaked the sighting to the press, and that's when he got ridiculed mercilessly. Surprisingly, perhaps somewhat accurately, the governor's favorability ratings actually go up. Either way, the episode ends with a firm conviction that the ET presence is real and that ETs are truly visiting our planet, even taking people on board and leaving them with little or no memory of the onboard segment. I liked that episode. What I liked about it is the subject was portrayed as being 100% real. And it also showed how people are profoundly skeptical of the subject and get ridiculed because of it. But again, shows that UFOs are real and actually portrays the missing time phenomena as well, with someone having an encounter and having no memory of being taken on board. So that's also pretty groundbreaking. It was a good episode. Now let's move to the next show, which is Night Court. Night Court has been recently rebooted. I'm talking about the original Night Court, which first aired on January 4th, 1984. It's a hilarious show, which at one point did cover the subject involving extraterrestrials. With 9 seasons, Night Court was definitely a very successful sitcom, and it was episode 37, titled The Hostage, that featured the UFO subject. This episode is all about this gentleman who is brought before the court under charges of stealing electronic parts. But the man claims that he is not subject to the laws of planet Earth because he is not an Earthling. he is actually an extraterrestrial from Saturn. He's dressed in flowing robes, and the entire court, of course, believes the defendant to be mentally deranged. The man takes attorney Dan Fielding, played, of course, by John Larroquette, hostage, and demands that the rest of the parts he needs to communicate with his home planet be delivered to him. The judge gets very angry, and the whole episode ends on this very interesting sort of note when the defendant waves his arms theatrically and disappears in a puff of smoke, leaving no doubt to everyone there that something very strange and inexplicable just happened, and that he could very well be an alien walking among us. I'm going through these episodes pretty quickly and summarizing them very briefly, of course, because otherwise we'd be here forever. But certainly an interesting appearance of an apparent extraterrestrial in front of the judge in a courtroom, an ET walking among us, which certainly makes you wonder because there are accounts of this. And that I thought was an interesting episode in that regard. And now we move to another sitcom, which I'm a little bit ashamed to say I did watch. It's probably not the best sitcom. I don't want to judge because it was a funny show. This is, of course, Charles in Charge, starring Scott Baio. This first aired on October 3rd, 1984, and it was pretty successful. It went for 4 years. And at one point, they had a pretty interesting episode featuring UFOs and alleged extraterrestrials. It was the 40th episode of Charles in Charge, Season 2, Episode 18, titled UFO Oh No, that they featured the UFO subject. The youngest child of the family, Adam, comes running into the house one evening saying he just saw a UFO. He says, and I quote, "It was round and it had flashing lights." Now his babysitter Walter doesn't believe him, but his 2 older sisters not only believe him, but become panicked when they see an unidentified rodent-like creature running through the house. So they're screaming hysterically, "Aliens! There are aliens in the house!" Walter tries to convince them all that UFOs are not real. Finally, the grandfather comes home and he's upset, saying that UFOs and aliens are, quote, "only hallucinations and hysteria." In fact, Adam's mother tells him to go upstairs and that she'll explain about things that, quote, "look like UFOs." Then, Walter looks out the window and sees the UFO himself, a, quote, "silver thing in the sky with blue flashing lights." He's convinced it's a genuine UFO. He reports his sighting to the local observatory, but is not believed. He's still convinced it's a real UFO. And then the grandfather sees the UFO himself. He's also convinced it's real, so he calls the local newspaper. And the reporter arrives and starts an investigation. And this is when the whole story unravels when it turns out their neighbor, Buddy, announces that he pulled off a hoax. He faked the UFO as part of an experiment to test the effects of the paranormal on the American family. And it turns out the furry creature running through the house is identified as nothing more than an escaped guinea pig. But the whole episode ends on a mysterious note when Buddy explains that he only faked 2 of the sightings and that he can't explain what the grandfather saw, which was apparently a genuine UFO. That was an interesting portrayal of the subject in a number of ways. It kind of shows the hysteria that can follow a UFO encounter, people jumping to conclusions, people conflating various phenomena. But I have to say I'm glad that it did end on a very unequivocal note saying that UFOs are in fact real. And this is a pattern we see in a number of these sitcoms. What starts out as an apparent hoax turns into an actual UFO incident. Very interesting. Now we move to another sitcom, which I never really watched. I'm certainly aware of it. This is, of course, Mr. Belvedere. First episode aired on March 15, 1985, but it wasn't until episode 80 that they tackled the UFO subject. But they did a good job, I have to say. Again, I was really impressed. Mr. Belvedere had a really good run, and it was episode 80, titled Graduation, that featured the UFO subject. The witness was, of course, the teenage son, Kevin, who returned home one evening very excited, claiming he saw a, quote, "a big round silver thing with rotating lights." He said it was hovering in the sky. He was deeply affected by this encounter. absolutely changed his outlook on everything, began checking out books on UFOs, and discovered that the subject was being taken very seriously by many researchers. He decides to do a UFO stakeout in his backyard, hoping to have another encounter. Unfortunately, the UFO fails to arrive, and Kevin becomes the subject of ridicule and disbelief, and various debunking explanations are raised to explain what he saw. However, at the very end of the episode, a genuine UFO shows up right over Mr. Belvedere's head. And this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, so if you don't want to know how this episode ends, skip to the next segment here, but this UFO shows up to Mr. Belvedere, speaks to him, and calls him Slim. Mr. Belvedere, who of course is not exactly slim, closes the episode by acknowledging the reality of UFOs and says out loud to himself, "I have developed a great fondness for extraterrestrials. Anyone who calls me slim can't be all that bad." So while the subject of UFOs was first treated skeptically, in the end of the episode, the existence of UFOs was unequivocally confirmed. I think that's an important episode because UFOs are obviously real, I think. The evidence supporting them is absolutely conclusive in my mind at this point. And what's interesting about this episode is, again, we have the least reliable character seeing a UFO. And he went through some good deal of skepticism and pushback and ridicule, but stuck to his guns. And it's also a very interesting episode because, again, in the end, the subject was portrayed as absolutely real. And I have to say that the ending of this particular episode made me laugh out loud. It was funny. So yeah, I recommend this episode, and I think it's a pretty accurate portrayal of this subject. Now let's move to the next sitcom, which I never watched. The sitcom is called Small Wonder. It's about a little girl who's basically a robot, a humanoid robot, and it did tackle the UFO subject and had some interesting things to say about it. But again, I don't really know this sitcom that well. I only watched this episode because there was a UFO theme to it. And ultimately, I was disappointed with how it was portrayed, but still, I'm trying to be comprehensive here, so I'm covering Small Wonder. Small Wonder was a surprise hit, really popular among children especially, and it's about a family whose father is a robotics engineer and the creator of a human-looking robotic daughter named Vicky. But important here is episode 81, titled My Favorite Martian. And when the ditzy neighbor sees a UFO, Vicky's father/inventor calls the Air Force to investigate, but little does he know the UFO is actually a projection created by his robot daughter Vicky. So to discredit their neighbor and debunk this sighting, they have Vicky create a projection of a little green alien, and this ruse works like a charm. The neighbor falls for the hoax and is persuaded into believing that Earth will be taken over by aliens and he will be the new world leader. So the whole treatment of the subject is entirely skeptical and frankly ridiculous. Ultimately, for me, a pretty disappointing treatment of the UFO subject, which is being portrayed solely as a hoax. Fine, this is how a lot of sitcoms, as far as they apparently have the courage to go with it. But it's important because this is how people seem to view UFOs, certainly much more so years earlier. Now, of course, it's getting a legitimacy that it's long deserved. So the times are moving forward, and I think we're definitely making progress with how this subject is being portrayed and perceived here in the United States and all over the world. But sitcoms are playing a role here. They do shape our beliefs to a certain extent and certainly reflect them. So this is important stuff. Now we move to the next sitcom, which was a huge smash hit. I've certainly seen a number of episodes. I was never really a fan, but I do recognize this award-winning sitcom, which is The Golden Girls. And I have to tell you, of all the portrayals of UFOs and this subject in the sitcom, I really liked this one. except for the fact that once again it's the least reliable character who is having the encounter. Featuring 4 older women as primary characters, The Golden Girls was absolutely groundbreaking. It was a runaway hit. Its all-star cast really struck a chord with audiences, and the show remained on the air for a full 7 years, and still remains in syndication today. It was an iconic series that finally broached the UFO subject in episode 78, titled The One That Got Away. Now Rose, the ditzy character, played by Betty White, was sitting on the porch with Dorothy, played by Beatrice Arthur, one evening when a huge silver object covered with colored lights appeared overhead.
Did you see that, Dorothy?
Now Dorothy thinks it's just a plane, but Rose is convinced it's a UFO. But of course, Rose is not exactly reliable. She's considered unintelligent, naive, gullible. However, after she reports the sighting to the Air Force, they all learn that this object is in fact unexplained. As Dorothy says, "Rose, they checked out what we saw, and it actually was a UFO." So this inspires Rose to spend more time outside waiting for the UFOs to return. This causes her to receive some good-natured ribbing from her friends. And then comes another plot twist. Turns out that the object they saw wasn't a UFO at all, but a secret military aircraft. However, the episode ends with Dorothy and Rose sitting outside. Dorothy closes her eyes to rest, and at that very moment the UFO reappears. Rose calls for Dorothy to wake up, but by then the UFO is gone. Rose sits back and smiles, knowing in her heart UFOs are real because she saw one. I really liked that episode of The Golden Girls. I thought it was a pretty darn good portrayal of the UFO subject because it shows 2 witnesses seeing a UFO, one being disbelieving, the other believing. Turns out that there is a real UFO, with the plot twist that it was not a UFO as we would think of it, but a secret military craft. Then in the end, the UFO shows up again. Rose is absolutely vindicated. It's a sweet episode. I thought it was really interesting. And now we move to the next episode to feature UFOs, which was the hilarious smash hit Married with Children. A really sort of irreverent sitcom, which was quite different from a lot of the other family shows of the 1950s, featuring parents who were not exactly role model parents. And it was a pretty long-lasting sitcom with 259 episodes. And yeah, they did a very hilarious featuring of the UFO subject. One of the longer lasting live action sitcoms on television, Married with Children, lasted a full 10 years, producing 259 episodes. It's interesting because it's usually in the 80s, episode 80s or so, that these sitcoms feature the UFO subject. And that's true with Married with Children. In episode 87, Married with Aliens, it begins with Al Bundy waking up in bed to see several short, silver-suited aliens in his bedroom. They're searching for something in his bedroom and finally steal his dirty socks. He tells his family, who, as you might expect, do not believe him. But a few nights later, it happens again. The aliens come into his bedroom, steal his dirty socks, and again he's the only one who sees the aliens, and again nobody believes him. So, to prove his story, Al Bundy obtains a camera and baits the aliens with more of his dirty socks. The aliens soon arrive. Again, they're only interested in his dirty socks. Turns out that they can use them as a fuel source. Al asks to take their picture, and the ETs oblige with a series of poses. However, in a stroke of bad luck, which is normal for Al, all the film is lost at the film developers. So Al ends up having no way to prove his story, but of course remains forever convinced in the existence of ETs. It's a hilarious episode, but hardly an accurate portrayal of the phenomena. But to its credit, it does stick to the premise that ETs are real. All the sitcom portrayals of the UFO subject, I have to tell you, I think that one, Married with Children, was the funniest episode of all. I mean, it's side-splittingly funny. But yeah, hardly an accurate portrayal of the UFO subject. But E.T.'s coming into the bedroom and stealing dirty socks for fuel. Come on, that's comedy gold. It was funny. And now we move to the next sitcom to feature the UFO subject, which was The Robert Guillaume Show. Robert Guillaume, of course, was originally on Benson and had his own show, The Robert Guillaume Show, which aired on April 5, 1989. It was quite short-lived, but did feature the UFO subject. So Robert Guillaume, star of both Soap and Benson, finally did get a show titled The Robert Guillaume Show, which didn't survive past its first season, but on episode 8, titled They're Here, this did feature the UFO subject. Robert Guillaume's father, Henry, woke up in the middle of the night saying he saw another one of those UFOs that he's been seeing lately. Now, Robert Guillaume plays a psychiatrist on the show and doesn't believe him, saying it was probably just a garbage truck. Henry, however, adamantly insists he saw a genuine UFO and will not budge from his story. But neither will Guillaume, and finally, Henry and Guillaume's secretary decide to conduct a nighttime UFO stakeout. And this is when Henry excitedly points out the moon and calls it a UFO. And this is when the secretary realizes that Henry is actually deluded or not mentally stable, cannot tell the difference between a UFO and the moon. But not wanting to hurt the old man's feelings, she says nothing. But then Henry decides to tell his story to a TV program titled Weird and Wonderful, who actually portrays this sighting as a genuine UFO, even though it's clear to everyone in the know, except Guillaume's father, that the story is not true. However, the whole affair ends on a mysterious note, when one evening, shortly later, everyone is seated in the living room and a mysterious, unexplained, eerie orange light shines in through the front door window. So ultimately, while unconfirmed, the possibility that UFOs are real remains an open question. Again, the pattern we see so often in these sitcoms is being laid out exactly, almost in a cliche way, where what starts out with a misidentification or a hoax or something along those lines turns out to end on a mysterious note, sort of pointing towards the reality of UFOs. It was a bit ambivalent, ambiguous, but certainly left the idea open that UFOs are real. And now we move to another sitcom. I've never really watched this one. This is the animated sitcom Dennis the Menace. And it had a pretty interesting portrayal of the UFO subject with a UFO landing, an actual ET, lots of interaction with this ET. It was pretty interesting. The animated series Dennis the Menace managed to produce 78 episodes over only 2 years. And it was season 1, episode 2, very early on, that there was an episode called A Visitor from Outer Space. Little Dennis was asleep in his bedroom when a miniature flying saucer enters through the window, scares his dog, wakes Dennis up. As Dennis flees his room in fear, the ET shoots a beam of light at him, shrinking him down to miniature size. Dennis runs outside and the ET follows, saying that he's come from millions of miles away in search of friendly contact with humans. The ET then returns Dennis to normal size, and Dennis gives the ET, whose name is Randar, a tour of the house. Then he brings the ET over to Mr. Wilson. And Mr. Wilson wakes up to see Dennis and the ET levitating, floating in the air outside his window, and calls the police. Meanwhile, the ET levitates Dennis back to his bedroom and departs. The police arrive to interview Mr. Wilson, who ends up looking like a crazy, deluded person, gets handcuffed by the police, and hauled off to the station for questioning. What I liked about that episode was, yeah, there was a landing, there was an ET. It shrunk Dennis down to miniature size. Interestingly enough, I do know of a few cases of that. And his poor neighbor, Mr. Wilson, of course, getting carted off by the police for spouting all this nonsense about UFOs, once again portrays how this subject is, not real in many people's minds. Very skeptical of this subject. So that as well is once again showing how difficult it is to move this subject forward when there's all this skepticism. And now we move to one of the most successful sitcoms of all times. It's still in production, and that is The Simpsons. And I have to tell you, The Simpsons has portrayed UFOs on numerous occasions. I'm only going to cover a few of the incidents because you could spend literally hours talking about The Simpsons' portrayal of UFOs and extraterrestrials. The Simpsons actually first aired on April 19, 1987 as an animated short on The Tracy Ullman Show, but became runaway characters and got their own show. And very funny. I watched it for years. And I think it's really interesting how they portray the UFO subject and do it in a really funny way. After appearing on The Tracy Ullman Show, The Simpsons got their own show on December 17, 1989, and it still remains the longest running and most award-winning sitcom in American history, still in production. It should come as no surprise that The Simpsons have had a few run-ins with UFOs and ETs. Often it's in their Halloween special episodes, Treehouse of Horrors, that this subject is brought up. For example, once while fishing in a lake, a saucer-shaped object appears over Homer's boat. A gigantic pincher emerges from beneath the craft and pulls Homer on board. Homer, inside the craft, is confronted by two enormous one-eyed green-skinned octopus-like ETs. And Homer tells them, "I suppose you want to probe me. Well, may as well get it over with." And Homer turns around and pulls down his pants. The two aliens recoil and one replies, "Stop. We have reached the limits of what rectal probing can teach us." So yeah, very funny. And making fun, of course, of this whole idea that ETs anally probe people. The ETs ask him, "Take me to your leader." But when Homer explains that an election is about to occur and that Bob Dole may replace President Clinton, the ETs end up taking both candidates on board, strip them of their clothes, and place them in glass tubes, and transform themselves into the two presidential candidates. Homer witnesses this whole procedure, so to discredit Homer, the ETs douse him in rum so that nobody will believe him, and they forcefully eject him from the craft. So that's them covering the UFO subject. But they do it over and over again. In another episode, the entire family is taken on board by ETs and treated to a sumptuous feast. It's a twist of the classic Twilight episode, To Serve Man, where Lisa finds an ET book titled How to Cook Humans. And the ETs said no. They remove dust from the cover and reveal the title to be How to Cook for Humans. But then Lisa removes more dust from the cover and the title is revealed How to Cook 40 Humans. And the twists go on and on. It's very funny. There are many more episodes featuring UFOs and aliens on The Simpsons, and in each of them the various ET tropes and conspiracies are explored with classic Simpsons hilarity, and with the given premise, to their kudos, that UFOs and extraterrestrials are very real. Kudos to the writers of The Simpsons for really diving deep into the UFO subject and covering every aspect of it, from how it affects politics to people being taken on board and anally probed and the whole deal. I mean, they really dived deep into this subject. So thank you to the writers of The Simpsons for having the courage to tackle this subject. Now we move to another sitcom, which never rose to super prominent status, but it was certainly a successful sitcom, having 172 episodes, which is definitely considered a success. And this sitcom is called Wings. This first aired on April 19th, 1990, and was very successful, and at one point did do an episode on UFOs, and it was well done. The sitcom Wings tells the story of a small airline run by two brothers, and it lands on the UFO subject with episode 22, Plane 9 from Nantucket. Joe and Brian, the owners of Sandpiper Airlines, are flying over Nantucket in their plane when they see a strange, quote, blue light. As they watch, it hovers, zips across the sky, and then shoots upward. It's absolutely a genuine UFO, and both of them are convinced of this. Joe, the conservative and sensible brother, he wants to keep the sighting a secret. But Brian, portrayed as impulsive and rash, decides to tell everyone. And now with their encounter revealed, both witnesses suffer ridicule from their co-workers. Brian gets really disappointed when his brother Joe refuses to admit to the reality of the sighting. So Joe calls the FAA, who sends over an investigator. And as might be expected, the FAA investigator is profoundly skeptical. And now Brian regrets going public. But then the brothers are confronted by a group of UFO witnesses. And under peer pressure, they admit that they did in fact see a UFO, and the entire group takes a flight up into the air and returns to the location of the sighting. In fact, a reporter joins them on the venture. Unfortunately, no UFO appears, and the reporter ends up writing a really nasty article ridiculing the sighting. But the message at the end of the episode is very clear. UFOs are real, but those who go public are likely to be ridiculed and disbelieved. I did like that episode because this did portray a UFO encounter by two pilots. Many pilots are seeing UFOs, and the UFO in this episode was real. What's important about this episode, I think, is the witnesses did decide ultimately it's probably best to keep quiet because they got so much skepticism and ridicule from people they loved and trusted and the mainstream media. This is absolutely an accurate portrayal of how people sometimes have to deal with having their own encounter. So that makes it, I think, an important episode. Now let's move to another sitcom called Step by Step. This is essentially a reboot of the Brady Bunch in many ways, involving a very large family with a lot of kids and having the regular antics and machinations that go on with a very large family. Its first episode was on September 20, 1991. Patrick Duffy, Suzanne Summers were the parents. And yeah, it was a funny sitcom. I watched several episodes. Was never a huge fan of it, but they did cover the UFO subject, and it was certainly an interesting portrayal. Step by Step featured the UFO subject on season 13, episode 13, on December 13, 1991, with an episode titled Getting Organized. One of the children, JT, who is portrayed as somewhat lacking in intelligence, and I'm putting that nicely, develops an interest in UFOs. Of course, he's also madly in love with a young girl who apparently despises him, and it's this young girl who decides to take advantage of JT's interest in UFOs, and she tells him that she was in fact contacted by the ETs who are visiting Earth for the purposes of obtaining aluminum. And she convinces JT and his best friend, who turns out to be her brother, who's also kind of dim-witted, she convinces them both to wrap their bodies from head to toe in aluminum foil to attract the ETs and to wait for them. And meanwhile, she hires a friend to fly a helicopter over the boys and shine a beam of light down on them. It's a cruel, expensive, and elaborate UFO hoax, but everything apparently goes according to plan. The boys dress up in foil, they make complete fools of themselves, while the girls film the entire prank. The helicopter arrives on schedule, beams the boys with light, and convinces them both that they've been visited by ETs. But, as fits the pattern of other sitcoms who featured this subject, the entire episode ends quite mysteriously when the girl's pilot friend calls them and says that he did not fly that helicopter. He was not able to get the helicopter and do this whole stunt. So apparently, what JT and his friend saw was a genuine UFO. Once again, we have UFOs being portrayed as nothing but a hoax, at least initially. Of course it does end on a mysterious note when it turns out that the witnesses seeing a UFO are actually not a victim of a hoax after all. Even though they were a victim of a hoax, it turned out that this last sighting was real. It's that same sort of cliche pattern we see in a lot of these sitcoms, but it's encouraging because the writers of the show are recognizing that this is a real subject. But again, I'm disappointed because it's the least reliable characters who are the witnesses to this UFO. Such a shame because, again, not accurate. Now we move to the last sitcom that I'm going to portray today, and that is South Park. South Park's premiere episode actually featured one of the main characters being taken on board and having a full-on UFO experience. South Park was an immediate hit. It's very irreverent, very cutting edge, very unfiltered. and it's really interesting because, as we'll see, they embrace the subject in a way nobody has ever done on any sitcom. Kudos to South Park for having their premiere episode feature UFOs. It's titled Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. And in this episode, ETs are visiting South Park, Colorado for the purpose of probing various citizens. And no surprise that it's Cartman who is taken on board and probed. This probe is apparently accidentally left inside of him. Now when the ETs abduct one of Cartman's schoolmates, they use the forgotten ET probe to lure the ETs back and rescue their friend. So South Park was an instant success, earning very high ratings, started winning all kinds of awards. It's been continually renewed and is now on its 26th, 27th season. It's made over 300 episodes. It's one of the most successful sitcoms of all times. And it's so interesting because ETs continue to make regular appearances in at least half the episodes. There's almost always this little ET doing a cameo in the background. I wonder if the writers of South Park have had their own experiences having portrayed UFOs in so many of their episodes. I mean, ETs in over half the episodes appearing as little tiny cameos. I think that's super interesting. I really wonder why they do that. It's quite a lot of talk about it on the internet. So, I don't know. It's just interesting overall. So I did cover all of these episodes in much more depth in my book, Not From Here. So if you really want to take another look at that, check that out. I've got a lot of other interesting chapters in the book. But yeah, dove deep into the subject of UFOs in the American sitcom. But yeah, there's 24 sitcoms portraying the UFO subject. And as you can see, our understanding of this subject is accurately reflected by these sitcoms, starting out with a lot of them being portrayed as absolute hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, mental illness, naivete, but moving forward, more and more being portrayed as absolutely real. The real disturbing pattern for me was pretty much every episode. The person who sees the UFO again is the least reliable character, which is certainly just not reflective of real life. So we still have quite some work to do in having this subject be portrayed accurately in the situation comedy. And I have to tell you, there are a lot of other sitcoms that not only portrayed UFOs, but basically embraced it as the complete theme of their show, such as My Favorite Martian or Mork and Mindy, Elf, of course, from 1986, Third Rock from the Sun, an E.T. family living among us, more recently People of Earth in 2016, or very recently Resident Alien, just to name a few. And of course, each of these treat this subject as completely real. But I will say that a good number of sitcoms absolutely did not have the courage to portray this subject whatsoever. Really prominent sitcoms such as Friends, Seinfeld, Modern Family, The Cosby Show never portrayed UFOs. Roseanne did not, as far as I know. Cheers didn't, or Laverne and Shirley, or Good Times, or Three's Company. All in the Family. MASH didn't do it either. Mary Tyler Moore, Leave It to Beaver. None of these portrayed the UFO subject. Honeymooners, Growing Pains, Who's the Boss? Most of them, I'm going to say, have not had the courage to portray the subject. Family Ties, One Day at a Time, The Partridge Family, The Wonder Years. I mean, I could go on. Frasier, Facts of Life, Happy Days, and so forth. Father Knows Best. Nope. Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, Malcolm in the Middle. No, none of them did. How I Met Your Mother, Fresh Off the Boat, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So most people have not portrayed this subject, which is really a shame. The Big Bang Theory, one of my favorite sitcoms, did mention UFOs at one point, but it was in a pretty sort of dismissive way. The Andy Griffith Show almost portrayed it, but it turned out that a person they all thought was an ET was just somebody who was very much in love with the town of Mayberry. But one thing is certain, the sitcom format continues to be popular. There's going to be more shows coming out, and because this subject, UFOs, is increasing in popularity all the time, it's only a matter of time before the subject is portrayed in another sitcom. Very interested to see how the writers will portray it. I'm really hoping that they are more accurate in who sees the UFO and portraying this subject as absolutely real. But that's it for today. That's the portrayal of UFOs in the American sitcom. It has a lot to say about how we view this subject. I think that alone is important. It's time we take a look at how this subject is being portrayed. So thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. This show is definitely a little different than most, so I hope you found it entertaining and informative. Truly appreciate you guys tuning in. It's because of you I do this research, that I'm putting these episodes together. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking those hard questions. And most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.